recording, so I'll just say
Okay.
I'm Will Maddox.
I'm Hannah Einhorn, and today me and Will are going to do our presentation on queer aesthetics and concepts in contemporary art.
I already skipped a slide. So a little bit about like the word queer, just so that we have a good understanding of our vocabulary here. Generally, when we're talking about queer theory, we view queer as a verb. So in the past, it may have been like a noun or an adjective, like I'm queer, or like when it's a noun, it's usually like a slur. But so what queer is contemporarily is anything that rebels against normative methods in identity, relationships, appearance, and so on. And so when we're talking about queer aesthetics and also queer concepts, since queering is rebelling against those norms, queer aesthetics are any aesthetic that sort of challenges a norm we've come to accept, and concepts are basically the same thing, but in a conceptual level. So when we're talking about queer artists, we aren't necessarily only talking about artists that identify as members of the LGBTQ plus community. A lot of the following artists do identify in that community, but any person, no matter their identity, can tap into these concepts or these aesthetics by challenging the norms around them.
So the first artist I will be talking about today is Moises Salazar. And Moises is a young trans non-binary artist based in Chicago who recently had a show with the Red Arrow Gallery in February. Their work is full of bright colors, often with a nude or glamorously adorned figure in the center of the composition. Their work is heavily inspired by Catholic iconography that represents the royalty and honor related to queer elders in the community. In an interview, they said, "I wanted to be like the women in my family, and I wanted to look like those Catholic icons that decorated my house." They responded to the ostracization of the queer community in religious spaces by purposefully making their subversive work create a, quote, chapel-like space. They used glitter to play off of the glamour of the Catholic artwork that they saw in their childhood while merging the aesthetic with modern-day queer aesthetics.
So an artist I chose was Paula Rico, and she isn't, totally fully contemporary, but I still thought she was important to include here because the sort of ideologies and concepts that she was working with were very contemporary. So she was working in the second half of the 20th century, but all the ideas and the ways that she was handling her paint were super ahead of her time, especially when it came to gendered representations. She queered things a lot in that area.
The second artist that I'm going to be talking about is Christina Quarles. And Christina is a queer woman who is inspired by her experiences within the LGBTQ plus community, as well as her experiences in both the white community and Black community as a biracial person. She's also inspired by methods of perception and visual identity markers. Her use of figures that morph between identities shows the fluid experience she has with her own identity markers. For example, in an interview, Quarles discussed the duality of being white passing to white people, but also being clocked immediately as a person of color by other people who are not white. Quarles recognizes the importance of intersectionality, touching on themes of race, gender, and sex, and the subjectivity that comes with each of those things. She notes that her painting practice is grounded in an extensive education in drawing in her early years of art education, and that it is a very loose, gestural process mixed with slight, quote, digital tinkering. In the same interview, the journalist interviewing her notes, quote, "Another push and pull that Quarles plays with is the opposition between a person's desire to be understood as a complex individual and the yearning to find community by identifying with a group. The fluidity of identity can be exhausting and even alienating, when trying to choose labels as a queer person.
Right, so my second artist is Marilyn Minter. She's an artist who's been working for a very long time. I believe she's 73 or so years old. And she's working with they're paintings. This is a painting, but they're very hyper realistic and they're very loud, which is sort of, I think, part of the queer aesthetic coming in there. But yeah, she's working at the intersection, I think, of gendered norms and feminism. This piece was from a collection called Nasty Woman. So she's really looking at feminism, but also going a step beyond feminism into gender generally.
So my next artist is Jess Fan, and Fan is a transgender Chinese American artist who works with various mediums in order to capture and isolate bodily materials such as melanin, blood, urine, semen, and hair. They identify their work as erotic, repulsive, and seductive all at the same time. Fan talks about their childhood in Hong Kong and cites a dark moment when they lived in a state of, quote, not being able to see a future extension of themselves due to a lack of representation. With their work, they seek to revive the sublime in depictions of beauty, while also expanding what this concept might look like in art through repulsion and viscera.
I also don't know if Jess Fan would say this, but I definitely feel like the work is sort of abject and has to do with that bodily fluid and sort of the visceral reaction we get from seeing fluid outside the body. So my next artist is Castles. Castles is a contemporary performance artist, and they work with like very intense bodily performance and use their body as a way to question norms about both gender and sex being like anatomy and genitalia. So they're very queer, but also understand that the queerness comes in their own being, their own body.
Catherine Opie is a lesbian fine artist and photographer who has dedicated a large portion of her career to documenting and showing the lesbian experience. This photo is a self-portrait of her nursing her son that she went on to raise with her wife. Opie is not necessarily making statements about queerness. Rather, it would be more accurate to say that she is simply showing herself and the people who reflect her, and therefore, her collection of work happens to connect heavily with her lesbian identity. In an interview, she said, quote, "My son was like, 'Mom, my friends are Googling you, and I don't know what to say to them.' I said, 'Just tell them your mom's a badass radical dyke artist.'"
Love that quote. Jenny Saville, or Jenny Saville. I think we decided on Saville in class. This is an artist we've looked at before, but she's very queer from a technical and conceptual standpoint. So technically, she's using oil paint, but she's using it in a way that you're not supposed to by not blending it and sort of letting us see that it is paint and not going for photorealism. And then she's also conceptually queering norms by well, in this series, where the piece on screen came from, she was depicting intersex people, but we've also looked at her work and how it sort of intersects with femininity, but I don't think she would consider it feminist work. Kehinde Wiley is my last artist and is also probably my favorite artist on this list, maybe ever. But so he works at the intersection of queering and race. And depicts masculinity in a queered light. So he's definitely working with these men of color and sort of working with the masculinity that comes from that, which is often when we talk about masculinity, we're talking about white masculinity, but don't realize we are. And so he's sort of calling attention to that. And all of his portraits directly reference, well, actually, I shouldn't say all of his portraits because some of his contemporary work, like newer work, doesn't. But most of his portraits directly reference art history, but insert people of color into that context of portraiture, which is queer because people of color have not been able to be in that context before. And here are our sources.